Good morning. Welcome to MEI's virtual webinar series. This morning, our subject is migrant workers in the Gulf, unseen struggles and prospects for reform. It's an important subject. According to the International Labor Organization, there are some 23 million migrant workers currently working in the Gulf, of whom about 40%, about 9 million, are women. The challenges that they confront are well known, long-standing. They have often been the subject of concern among labor activists and human rights activists. The COVID-19 pandemic has added a new and extremely dangerous wrinkle to the lives of millions of these workers. To discuss those issues and to think through how not only are we coping with this present crisis, but how can we use this as a platform, as a springboard for moving to a better future for migrant labor in the Gulf, and what does the current economic stress in the region portend for the future of migrant work in the Gulf. We are fortunate to have two outstanding panelists with us today. The first is Rima Saban. Rima is the Assistant Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in Dubai. She oversees two graduate programs there, a Master of Arts in Diplomacy and International Affairs and a Master of Art in Judicial and Islamic Studies. Rima has authored and co-authored multiple book chapters and papers on youth, globalization, and Gulf civil society, among other things. Also joining us today is Hiba Zayedan. Hiba is a researcher at the Human Rights Watch, specializing in Middle East and North Africa, investigating human rights abuses, particularly in the UAE and Qatar. She previously worked at Human Rights Watch as a research assistant, helping to investigate human rights abuses in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and authored a report on Jordan's discriminatory law and the treatment of non-citizens in Jordan. Prior to joining the Human Rights Watch, Hiba served for 4 years as the editor of the Middle East and North Africa desk at IFEX, a global network of organizations working to promote and defend freedom of expression as a fundamental human right. She holds a bachelor's degree in broadcast and print journalism. Although this is a virtual meeting, I'll be taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature that if you're tuning in from a computer or iPad, if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A feature and you can ask questions that way. If you are tuning in on a telephone, iPhone, you can ask your questions via Twitter, going to #MEI events or email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please also contact events@mei.edu. So let us begin, and I'm going to ask Rima first for her opening comments, and then we will do the same with Hiba. So Rima, over to you, and welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jerry, for giving me this opportunity to talk about and to look at an important issue and to take me away from grading and ending our semester. I would just give a few points like on the issue, and then we could expand on each point if you want later. First, I'd like to start by saying globalization that has brought to humanity lots of opportunities. It has along brought lots of risks. And some of those risks are so detrimental to the whole globe, even not just for humans. And one of the major risks that are facing humanity today is COVID-19. You all know a lot about it. I'm not going to address it. It has infected around 5 million around the world, and the rate of death has been like 6.5 globally. However, also the Gulf has been among the countries in the Arab world and in the Middle East among the more affected by COVID-19. But despite that, the numbers are 138,000 in the whole Gulf, with a percentage of 0.6, that comparing to 6.5 around the world. I want to give like a little bit of a global sense. I know like that I have put like 6 points recommendation that are very, very good in that. There have been some good practices for migrants under COVID in the world. I'm going to take two examples from Europe. The best one is Portugal, who extended citizenship to all migrants. However, in France, there have been bad reports, like in Camp Calais, for example, very bad. Coming to the Gulf, as you mentioned, 23 million, 14% of the world migrants are in the Gulf. And this is it's part of the vulnerability of the Gulf model and the heavy reliance on foreign workers. So there has been vulnerabilities. I'm going to point like the large number. The living conditions for workers, mostly, and migrants are so condensed in rented rooms. Sometimes the number in one room could reach 18, which is like really and terrible, even for COVID, and for government even to deal with this. The third rank in vulnerabilities are the illegals. And this has been an issue ongoing in the Gulf and around also the deportation and what have you. Extending regulations around that. The fourth vulnerable category are domestic workers and runaways in that, particularly also under COVID-19. We could talk about the reasons and why. However, having said this, I know that the Gulf countries have been trying to improve on their treatment of migrant workers, and having been living and following up with some of the procedure, UAE has been the most proactive on this portfolio. And in 2019, it came number 16 in treatment of migrant domestic workers, migrant workers in general. It came before England, and also it was the best in the whole of Asia, even before Singapore. However, the rate of the challenges today is so huge. So the government have faced lots of things, but I can say I don't have real like evidence, but most Gulf countries have been taking the decision to provide healthcare, protection, food for all migrants. UAE had extended their visa. Oman has provided amnesty. Some countries, there are reports on Qatar that of some practice where workers have been working under the COVID-19, but not in other countries in the Gulf. So the situation has some aspects of positivities, but has some issues. As I said, the most vulnerable, the illegal, the domestic workers, there have been reported cases of some racism. And here, I want to close my notes to say that today we are all in need to work together to address this issue. ILO has been putting those 6 recommendations. They need enforcement, and we need all to follow up on the situation locally, nationally, internationally, humanly. We need better reporting. I don't think the media has been doing it. It has been sometimes misreporting. So hopefully we could raise this. And the last I could say, we need more studies and more understanding of the cases on the ground. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rima. Hiba, would you like to make your first comments?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I think one thing I would want to start with is on the labor governance systems in the Gulf, and how they themselves have over decades allowed for systemic discrimination that now we can see has really been exposed and has really deepened the struggles that migrant workers have already been facing. The Kafala system, which is the sponsorship system that governs migrant labor in the Gulf, is one that has been written about a lot and has been exposed a lot over the years. And it is one that ties migrant workers to their sponsors, to their employers, in terms of their immigration status, which really relegates responsibility to the private citizen over migrant workers' status in the country. That has allowed employers to have excessive control and excessive power over migrant workers. And so the power dynamic has always been skewed towards the employer, often a private citizen. That has led to a lot of issues. There's 5 pillars to the Kafala system. So many, most of these countries in the Gulf have introduced some reforms that have attempted to chip away at the Kafala system. But unless the system as a whole, from the work that I've done over the past couple of years on migrant worker in the Gulf, what I've seen is chipping away at the Kafala system has not really fixed that imbalance in the power dynamic. So there's 5 pillars to the Kafala system that where migrant workers are tied in terms of their entry into the country to employers, in terms of their residence in the country, in terms of their ability to change employers, their ability to exit the country, and terminate their contracts unilaterally. And so a lot of countries have introduced reforms that kind of chip away at some of these pillars, but the imbalance remains. And so migrant workers are still facing, they fear retaliation. A lot of countries have introduced better access to redress, but still there's that initial obstacle, which is fear of retaliation. So these are some of the pillars I've kind of alluded to here, but won't go into in detail unless people are interested in that. This is what allows for and drives abuse and drives the way that we see workers trapped and stranded. Passport confiscations are still on the rise, even though they've been banned in some of the countries. That practice has been banned, but implementation has not been very strong either in terms of these reforms and enforcing them. So one of the biggest issues that migrant workers face, and one of the biggest complaints that I hear over and over again, is wage abuses. And workers have, for a long time, even though they've introduced wage protection systems, which are designed to protect workers from unpaid, underpaid, delayed wages. But it continues to be one of the most common grievances amongst migrant workers, some of them for months without pay. And this is, of course, looking back at their migration cycle, paying recruitment fees. People come in destitute, they come in indebted, and they just become even more and more indebted. And this is common, this is pretty common. It's not, it hasn't been reformed, even with these wage protection systems, which honestly are almost a misnomer because they're basically wage monitoring systems. And even at that, they don't work that well. You have labor courts, but again, it's delayed. People wait years sometimes to be able to get their money and end up going home because they can't get other jobs. It's just a very restrictive labor system. so that's kind of the context that we are already in. You know, workers are already being abused and exploited. There isn't enough accountability for employers. And so the crisis hits. And it has just really helped expose in an unprecedented way how just how vulnerable migrant workers in the Gulf are, especially low income laborers. And so it has not only exposed it, but it has also deepened their struggles. So we've got tens of thousands of workers now that have been stranded, that have been laid off from their jobs. Food and housing are both crises right now. People are worried about whether they're going to be able to feed themselves that night, let alone their families back home, whether they're going to have a bed to sleep in. And here we're talking about undocumented workers who, like low-income employees, are some of the most vulnerable because they live outside of labor camps. So I mean, the most immediate concern that Gulf countries had was the spread of the virus, and that we see in these overcrowded, unsanitary labor accommodations that are just appalling and should not have been the case to begin with. So now that you're grappling with this crisis, you realize, you know, just how unforgivable that is to allow people to be kept in these kinds of situations outside of the cities, you know, hidden from view. And so that's what we're seeing here. People have already been suffering from wage abuses, and now more and more so, they're stranded, unable to go home. You know, we hear a lot of reports about workers and not getting enough protective gear or enough sanitized accommodations. It's practically impossible to practice social distancing. So this is the second point that I wanted to get to was how this crisis has further shown this. Obviously, we can talk a little more about repatriation and deportation efforts, some of which have been really irresponsible and how they've been carried out. You know, but the one point that I wanted to get to in terms of the systematic discrimination is just the pandemic has shown just how disposable Gulf regimes view the foreign workers, without whom their economies could not have really thrived. And that is what we're seeing now with countries scrambling to return workers, kind of to just, you know, shift responsibility away from the government and away from the employers themselves. To kind of get a bit into domestic workers and women basically in the Gulf who face unique challenges and lack protections on top of the challenges that most migrant workers face. They are often isolated domestic workers in homes, they're overworked, they're underpaid, often denied a day off, denied freedom of movement. In some of the worst cases, they're not given phones and cannot communicate with their families or the outside world, so they're unable to really report the abuses that they face. They have less protections than other migrant workers, even though many of the countries in the Gulf have introduced laws specifically for domestic workers, but they're often not as good or of the same standard as the labor law in the country or international standards of how migrant domestic workers should be protected. And we can get a bit more into that. But I've also wanted to point out that, yes, there have been measures, temporary measures taken by governments in the Gulf. Some of them have been good in terms of the migrant worker population, which, as Rima had mentioned, you know, automatic extensions of visas, the provision of accommodation, food, guaranteed access to free of charge healthcare. But then there have also been measures that have only sought to benefit citizens and can be used to really further exploit migrant workers. So several countries are allowing businesses to modify or terminate contracts, you know, force unpaid leave on migrant workers, reduce their wages. And this is, again, always introduced in terms of migrant workers, but not nationals. And so that also allows for exploitation, because again, it all goes back to the main tenet of the Kafala system, which allows for migrant workers to be exploited by their employers, which gives the employer excessive control. And so really migrant workers don't have that much of negotiating power. Yeah, and then I guess we can get into some of the recommendations later on. But again, we as Human Rights Watch and, you know, Amnesty International, Migrant Rights, other organizations that have really been working on this, We've been, communicating with these governments, they're providing temporary recommendations, basically, to make sure that the crisis doesn't unnecessarily exacerbate abuse, and in order to actively protect vulnerable populations at this time of crisis. But again, I want to stress that these are temporary, and radical change really is needed to be able to say that we can improve the lived circumstances of migrant workers in the Gulf.
Well, thank you, and thank you both for those opening comments. And let me just ask both of you. Obviously, the stresses, the pressures on the entire model of economic development in the GCC countries that had relied, as you both said quite correctly, that had relied for decades on the availability of migrant labor. I mean, the fact that that at all levels, at all sectors of the economies of the GCC countries, heavy dependence on migrant workers, but that structure was already under pressure. And if you look at systems like Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, equivalent proposals in the other GCC countries, most of these governments were already focused on trying to reduce the number of migrant workers in their societies, to shift more of the private sector labor force to nationals, away from migrant workers. And so this was already a system that was in transition. And what's happened in these last 4 or 5 months has really served to exacerbate and perhaps to expedite that transition, but it's not the sole cause of it. And so as we've been looking over these past few years at the changing nature of labor, employment, economic structures in the GCC, how did you see the governments addressing this whole question about what to do about migrant workers? The migrant workers themselves were becoming more insistent on their rights. Their governments, I think, were also becoming more insistent on protecting the rights of migrant workers in the Gulf areas. And you already had economic pressures to try to move them out. So how have those fundamental changes revealed themselves? How have they been expressed through this current crisis?
Sorry, Jerry, is that question to me
please.
or Rima? Rima, you can go ahead, please.
Both of you, actually.
Rima, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, all right. Let me say thank you, Jerry. And I would like to remind everyone in this that the Gulf model is of economic development is a Western model. It has adopted, it is practiced everywhere. Now, the only difference in the Gulf is that the number of the migrant laborers across in Europe and the States are all there. Illegal migrants are everywhere around the world. So it's not, the only difference is statistics, I could say, the numbers, the sheer numbers. And the Gulf has been historically working on this. And the Gulf is a very case specific where, for example, I would speak for UAE as an example, where 90% of the population are non-national, are foreigner, are expat. And the rate of tolerance in the UAE is incomparable if we look at Europe and other countries. So the Gulf has been really putting strong effort. UAE has launched a ministry of tolerance to address those issues. And even before, at the start of the epidemic, I think one of the rulers that come and say, we would not accept any case. So they've been spreading, because, you know, this is a society that moved from not having anything to all wealth. So there is a big wave of change. It's a tsunami of change. So that need to be really addressing cultural issues, cultural changes. Yes, people need to be educated how to deal with the migrants, how to deal with laborers. The Gulf needs to do a lot. What they have in front of them is a lot. And now with this pandemic, I personally think that is gonna raise the whole question of this model. I personally, because I've been following, UAE is the #1 country that is going ahead of most countries in the region and in the Middle East in terms of sustainability project and addressing. And I would not rule out that post COVID-19, UAE is gonna change these models, and the whole Gulf has been calling to minimize the dependency on labor. But yes, the Kafala system has been, as you said, and also Hiba had mentioned, it has been a thorny issue. So countries, as you mentioned, like Saudi Arabia, 2030, UAE also have pushed for procedures, tadbir, privatization, corporatization, and minimizing the dependency on workers and migrants. And now laborer, for example, I am almost sure that there will be new regulations and procedures to the living conditions of the labor camp. However, I like to note also to tell Hiba, because I live in the city, they are not like in prisons, they can go and come back, but they are transported in buses. However, you see them on Fridays going, you see them, we see them in streets, we see them in market. There are particular markets you can go on Friday, you see laborers. It is a very complicated issue, because I myself, when I traveled and I saw like the condition, the living conditions of poor people in the sending countries, I was like, oh my gosh, now I understand why they accept to live like this. And because there is also a culture, so the laws and regulations move, but culture is more difficult to change in society. Culture of people employing, and the culture of labor. But there is a rise if you follow social media, if you follow, because it happens that I followed sometimes a site of social media for domestic workers, and I see like they're working, they're posting like, oh, this is our status, we're doing this, we're doing so. And there are great cases of treatment, but those cases go unreported, and there is a focus, even if there is one bad case, it overrides all the 23 million. And this is unfortunately the situation and the vulnerability to all parties. As an educator, the thing that I would call for is including more courses and more understanding of the Kafala system. It has been a process. The Gulf adopted it from old times and Ottoman, and it's taking time to change it. I will stop here. Forgive me if I took longer.
Thank you, Rita.
I don't know if I answered in fully, but bits and pieces here. Okay.
Thank you very much. Hiba?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make the distinction that I wasn't saying that migrant workers are being held in these camps and not have, relative freedom of movement. Just that, they are, these labor accommodations that migrant workers are put in are kind of outside, the downtown area, the main cities where people and tourists are coming in, investors and whatnot. And yes, they are housed in rooms 6 to 12 in a room, even though the law might say that you're not allowed to have more than 4 people in a room and you shouldn't have bunk beds. That's not the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that people are being housed 6 to 12 people in a room, hundreds to the same bathrooms. I mean, this is the reality across the Gulf, in the UAE and in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia and in other Gulf states. I think I agree that we should have a lot more studies on the situation on the ground. It's been extremely difficult. And I'll say this for the UAE specifically. We have had a lot of trouble doing our research freely and without danger and risk to the people that we speak to and to our sources in the UAE. Because of a real restriction and on the ability to do research, academic research or journalistic research. And I think, yes, there are good cases, but that always depends on the actual employer. If the employer is good, then the employees are being treated well, but that's not how we're advocating for it to work. We want to have better protections for migrant workers so that in cases where you have the one or two unscrupulous employers, then they can have real access to avenues of justice and get their dues, get that paid. And it's not a cultural thing. It is the system itself that doesn't allow people to be able to move freely from job to job, that keeps them trapped in debt in these kinds of situations. I mean, the fact that people of, migrant workers, especially low paid workers, don't get paid for months on end, get delayed wages for years sometimes, that should not be acceptable in any world. And it's not the same in Western countries, I understand, or other, other systems around the world, because the fact that they're tied to their employer is what allows for this, and what makes it extremely hard for governments to monitor and implement smaller reforms that they are making, because at the end of the day, there will always be a loophole that the employer can exploit. And that's what we've seen. You fix, you introduce labor courts, faster dispute committees, but still, you haven't decriminalized absconding, which is where if a migrant worker leaves their employer, they can be designated as runaways. And then they face arrest and deportation. If their employers don't renew their residency permits for them, then they face arrest and they face deportation. So they face the consequences for the failure by employers to regulate their status or regularize their status in the country. And so these are all loopholes that exist that allow for employers to control their migrant workers, and that really undermine any reform process that is taken, minor or major in some cases, but as long as they have excessive power over migrant workers, we won't see real change on the ground for migrant workers, especially laborers, but also others. People in high-skilled jobs also face issues with their employers and face, blackmail or withholding of wages or that kind of thing. And obviously now the economic crisis as a result of the pandemic, but also the crash in oil prices is only going to increase and make it more difficult for migrant workers. And I don't know if going forward we're going to see a real change, because even the reforms that have taken place have not been implemented effectively in a lot of cases, or enforced, or have real accountability measures in place to make sure that these reforms do actually benefit migrant workers. And so the systemic discrimination, I find that it has really, cracked open just how much migrant workers are struggling in the Gulf. And they come in expecting, better lives and to be able to pay, for their families back home, to build houses, all of that. And a lot of the times they end up going back destitute. And we keep seeing that it is as a result of the system in place that allows for this, and that allows for them to not be able to get their dues and get their rights.
So if I can, and again, if I can pursue that for a moment, the IMF estimates that the Middle East region, Middle East North Africa region, will see a contraction of economic activity by about 4% over this year. Most people think that that is, if it's only 4%, they would think that that's a great success, that it's most likely to be far worse economically than just that downturn. And as you said, Hiba, in many ways, the system is designed to protect the employment rights, the social rights of citizens. And that comes at the expense, in some cases, of migrant workers. And so how do you see these societies trying to grapple with what to do in this situation where, frankly speaking, many of these migrants are going to end up being excess labor? There aren't going to be jobs for them. There may be difficulties, challenges for them to go home for all of the reasons that you laid out. And so how are these governments going to manage what could be an extremely difficult situation?
I think what this crisis has shown is that real systemic change, radical change is required. Because it was a public health crisis specifically, and not just an economic one, it has shown that this can be dangerous for the whole society. The fact that the virus can spread like wildfire in labor camps, has shown just how unsustainable that mode of living and that mode of governance is. But that's how these states have been built for decades now. They run and they build in that, and they've been built that way. And so without real radical change, I think, and this might be a pessimistic view, but I think, the systemic discrimination has also shown that there has already been segregation between, citizens and more privileged expatriates, and then people you call, the blanket term we use to say migrant workers, which are people coming from, Africa and South Asia, and who are in these kinds of labor camps, and are suffering the most, have been laid off, not been working. My point here is that countries are scrambling to repatriate and deport these migrant workers, sometimes really irresponsibly, without doing any testing. The UAE, for example, has been putting a lot of pressure on its ties with sending countries, India, Pakistan, and the such, to take back their citizens as soon as possible, even though we know that these countries themselves are struggling a lot more and do not have the quarantine facilities to be able to handle such an influx. And they're threatening, their economic ties with these countries at a time of crisis, when, without these workers, none of these Gulf economies would have flourished. So yes, there are, Saudiization policies and Emiratization policies and, nationalization policies, basically to try and have more citizens in the workforce. But the reality is that they will continue to rely on foreign workers. And at this point, what we see is how dispensable, how disposable migrant workers are to these regimes, even though without them, they couldn't have shouldered these economies. And so they're scrambling to send them back and have their own countries deal with them, even though it should be the responsibility of the employer and also the government to take care of laid off migrant workers at this point. And the way I see it is, because they're going to continue to rely on workers, they'll just they'll send these back and bring new ones to the Gulf, and they will continue to build their economies and to build their infrastructure and everything they need to hold these glamorous conferences and World Cup and Expo 2020 and that kind of thing. And so and the sending countries rely on these remittances and rely their citizens going abroad to the Gulf and working there. So I don't see that there will be much of a less reliance on foreign workers. And I think it will continue as is unless the Gulf countries can see more long term that this is just unsustainable. The next time a public health crisis hits, they will suffer. And all of these Gulf countries have increased numbers of COVID, and they don't provide breakdowns. A lot of them don't provide enough transparent breakdowns. But the majority are migrant workers, and it is as a result of the labor accommodations that house them. And if they're undocumented and live outside of that, then they also live in really cramped and unsanitary conditions. And then we haven't even talked about immigration detention centers and how they also are held in these kinds of situations without adequate medical care. And so, that's just my pessimistic view on it. But we do have recommendations.
Okay, well,
for how they can make it better.
Always those reports. This is your job, to be on the pessimistic.
On the pessimistic side, yes.
Yes, this is part of your job. This is why you're paid for. And I'm not trying to portray a pessimistic or optimistic. I'm trying to be as objective as possible. Because I'm not paid to write for this or that. My choice to write on migrant workers have been a personal choice, and unfortunately, in my practice, I have seen how much those organizations could be politically politicized and often biased, and they're politicized for it's a political pressure. I agree with you. Human situation need to change. We need to improve. The problem is a problem since the Gulf countries have started. It is a model they have adopted. Gastarbeiters and Germany, we all knew that. It has been across. It's part of the capitalist system. The Gulf did not create this capitalist system. It has been existing. They need to improve, and they will improve. There is rising, but it takes time. And don't forget that this whole development has happened so swift and so fast now. And there are so many appalling situations in the world and in the West that are not highlighted as much as the cases, and particularly Qatar and UAE. And I have been following up those reports. Whenever there is a global project like the FIFA Qatar is attacked. UAE UAE Dubai is attacked. So whenever there is like something shining, they use the migrant reports to attack. Well, when there isn't, these reports slow down. It is so.
I can respond.
Well,
I personally, I don't want to talk about my life, but I know it has came back to me. Something I have wrote, and I didn't know that it was published. It came back to me through a close relative and that was supposed to be something objective. It came back to me from the American ambassador, and I was shocked myself. Yeah. It is very political reports.
Well, not to belabor the issue. I mean, there is no system that is free of abuse. This is absolutely true. I would also say that there's no lack of attention to some of the abuses here in the United States by the American people, by the American press, about the issues related to migrant workers in the agricultural sector, meat processing, practically a daily basis. So not to go down that particular rabbit hole. I did want to ask you, Rima, we have-
I was hoping I can just respond to Rima on a couple of points, and we can move on from that. But just one point.
One point, and then we want to
Okay,
move
just
on
one
because
point.
we have questions.
No, really, I just wanted to respond to the, you said that we are getting paid to do this work, and yes, we are. But we completely adhere to international human rights standards and what migrant workers and just labor in general, the way that these frameworks should be and the way that migrant workers should be protected. And yes, we can say that some of these governments have introduced some reforms, and you're saying they will improve, and I'm sure they'll keep improving, and we should give them some time. But honestly, the migrant worker on the ground cannot wait that long. They are putting so much money into being able to secure these jobs, to come to these countries, and then end up leaving destitute. They cannot wait. We can wait. I can sit. I'm getting paid, and I can sit here and wait until the Gulf countries can, introduce systemic reforms on a longer term and on longer decades. But that's not really the lived reality of migrant workers on the ground. They are suffering and they are being exploited, and it is as a result of this systemic discrimination that exists. And on the issue of why we use these events, such as the World Cup or the Expo, that is because the governments themselves are using them to whitewash this. The fact that World Cup workers are building these stadiums, that not just stadiums, but we're talking about all of the infrastructure in Qatar, is being built on the backs of migrant workers. Shouldn't they be benefiting just as much as the country is benefiting from the international shining and the glamour and the glitz that they're getting from the World Cup? Shouldn't migrant workers also be benefit from that? And that's why we use these kinds of events, because we know that there's international scrutiny, and we know that when there's international scrutiny, we hope to see more change. But we have long written about migrant workers in the Gulf, long before the World Cup, long before the Expo 2020, long before any other such international event. And we have laid out time and time again the discrimination that exists within the systems. What we do when we have such big events is to make sure that we can actually have change. And Qatar would not have introduced any reforms had they not won the bid, and had there not been a forced labor complaint against them at the ILO. And so these are strategies, yes, that human rights organizations and others use. And I don't see that as being non-objective or politicized. This is the way that we have to work to be able to create change. And in every context, it's different.
Thank you.
I'll end at that.
Can I, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, you're gonna give me the right to say something after. Let us see.
Well, let us turn to some of the questions from the audience. And Rima, let me ask you first. We have a question from Ashna Mathima. Is there any example of a good practice in Gulf countries that illustrates good housing policy encompassing the needs of migrant workers, something that is humane in terms of social and health consequences, inclusionary and proactive on parts of the government, not simply left to market forces?
That's a very good question that is not left to market forces, because we all know that market forces and the capitalist system is always exploitative. However, yes, in my work, I came across lots of good practices, domestic work, and actually, even my students have recently done is amazing of cases and how they saw the domestic workers as them. So there are things rising. I know domestic workers who became business leaders in their villages. I am currently trying to work on a study on those good practices and interviewing domestic workers who are working. Hopefully I can do it over this summer, who are working for 10 years and more, and then myself look at those cases and why they have stayed. I would say that that you cannot find one family, one household in Kerala that does not have workers in UAE and particularly in Dubai, and they all love it. When you talk to those communities, you talk about being here, they like it. Yes, those who are trafficked from their countries here, they do face really annoying situations. I have seen them even myself in my eye, and I was trying to run to save one little girl, but then it disappeared in the street. The sheer number make the topic so hard, make controlling, make implementation of regulation very hard on the country, and even now under the epidemic, to go and do this. It is hard. They are cleaning these places. Anyway, I'm trying to go back to her answer. How to give you these cases, like when you have, for example, a domestic workers that have already like 5-6 pieces of land, that have built her house, that has built 2-3 houses and renting them, that is, while she's working, that is buying and selling clothes. I could tell you more and more about similar cases that I know. That's why now I wish like I would report myself on these cases that go unreported, because if we don't have those good cases, why they want to come back, why they want to run away, why they want to go against the government regulations in India and to come and work here, if they did not hear and see good cases back home in their villages, good changes.
Okay, well, thank you, Rima. Hiba, let me ask you another question. This one is from Matthew Smith, and I'm going to build on it a little bit. His question is, what is the role of the United Nations and NGOs, such as Human Rights Watch, in promoting reform to stop the abuse of migrant workers in GCC nations? And let me ask you on top of that, to talk a little bit about the reforms that HRW is recommending.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think, international organizations in the United Nations, play a really important role in one, finding alternatives to the system. At least, with the ILO in Qatar now are working alongside the government to try and phase out the Kafala system, to have it abolished before World Cup 2020 and 2022, and that hasn't. We're 3 years in and we still haven't seen much change. And at this point, yes, the crisis has kind of upheld everything. But as international organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and others, our role is to expose and to advocate on behalf of migrant workers who are unable to advocate for themselves, because across the region, they cannot have trade unions, they cannot strike, they cannot speak up. These are, okay, maybe in some companies, and in Qatar recently, they've done that, they've allowed for some worker representations within the company, but they cannot have trade unions, they cannot unionize, they cannot collectively bargain, they can't do any of that at this point in the Gulf. So international organizations have a duty to speak on their behalf. And that's what we hope to do. We hope to be able to expose how reforms are not being implemented correctly and what can be done. And in every report that we write, we offer recommendations to governments. We also offer them the right to reply before we release reports. We give them a chance to explain to us what has been done that we might not have seen, measures that have been taken. And then we analyze those and we look at them in relation to international standards and how it should be. And we offer recommendations. And currently, the recommendations we're offering during this crisis are quite temporary. One, they relate to, again, labor accommodations. You should be allowing for social distancing. So you should be probably repurposing empty buildings, buildings that haven't been used or aren't being used currently, to house migrant workers in a responsible and just remotely dignified way. So that's one major issue and one immediate concern that we've been looking at is obviously the spread of the virus. A lot of countries have implemented lockdowns on these areas, and so whether you have it or you don't have it, you're under lockdown. They've got temporary hospitals in there. Again, it's all these temporary measures that are layered on top of each other to deal with this temporary workforce. Again, these are people who will spend 10 years, 20 years, 30 years sometimes in the country, and are still considered temporary because there's no way for them to become permanent under the Gulf immigration policies right now. So these are, and another recommendation is to ensure that workers are getting paid. Again, there is responsibility here on businesses as well. And the UN has, human rights principles for businesses. So the businesses, but the governments have to also intervene to make sure businesses are, taking the responsibility that they should be taking for migrant workers. So they should ensure, that workers are not evicted if they are laid off or furloughed. That they still have access to food, that they are getting paid. These are, again, my point about being pessimistic is that we've looked at older reforms or past reforms being in the way that they've been implemented, and we haven't seen them being implemented or enforced well. So even these temporary measures that have been announced, we don't know. And at this point, it's very difficult for us to even be able to document and monitor as well as we could have possibly before because of the lockdown around the world and travel restrictions. But we know from the past that measures were never, rarely implemented and monitored and enforced correctly. And so we don't see that happening now. Yes, for example, the UAE has called on landlords not to evict workers. But again, a lot of it is very informal. And workers are renting from other workers. And, in terms of food, they say you should be providing food, but a lot of workers are going hungry. And we hear this. We talk to migrant workers every day to understand the struggles that they're facing. And so these are some of the short-term recommendations. Obviously, our long-term recommendations are structural overhaul of the system itself. Wage protection systems are not working. And again, that is the number one issue amongst migrant workers is unpaid, delayed, and reduced wages. So there needs to be an alternative to that. And the ILO offers these kinds of alternatives. So we should be working together and ideally with governments to be able to bring about these changes. And we hope that they heed the recommendations, because really the crisis has shown that it won't just affect the migrant workers, but it will affect citizens eventually, because the more they leave, the more the economy becomes a lot more catastrophic than it is now. There will be that domino effect, and the economy as a whole will suffer. And from a public health aspect, that is the same too. So I think what Gulf regimes should be seeing now is that there is this codependence, and if you allow for migrant workers to be able to work and live sustainably and in a dignified manner, then that too will reflect on your economies and your countries.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm afraid that is the last word. I think that we could have probably gone on for a lot longer talking about
I thought I had
what
to,
is a very
to add to Hiba on all this that she had said, but
okay. Well, we're going to have to bring you both back on for another hour to continue discussing this, because it is in fact an incredibly important subject. It's a subject that is not going to go away. While the pandemic has exacerbated it, it didn't create it, and it's not going to end it. And so there's going to be a lot more to talk about on this subject. I do want to thank both Rima Salban and Hiba Zaidan for an extremely informative and spirited conversation. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in for this hour, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you for having us.